On the 14th of October, 1814, the hired carriage deposited Eleanor Ashworth at the foot of a gravel drive so long and so impossibly grand that she was certain the driver had made a terrible mistake. The letter had promised nothing more than a position caring for a child in need, penned in an elegant hand she did not recognize, and sealed with plain wax that bore no identifying mark. She had read it 47 times in the 5 days since its arrival, memorizing each careful word, searching for some hint of who might have remembered her existence when the rest of the world had so thoroughly forgotten. The wind pulled at her faded blue traveling dress, the best she owned, though its cuffs were frayed and its color had softened from countless washings, and she clutched her single worn carpet bag against her chest as if it contained something precious rather than the meager sum of her earthly possessions. Grey autumn light filtered through clouds heavy with the promise of rain, casting the enormous house before her in shades of silver and shadow, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict with a fear she had not anticipated. This was no modest country home seeking a governess. The columns alone were taller than any building in the village where she had spent her final humiliating weeks, and the windows stretched upward like dozens of watching eyes. And somewhere in the distance she heard a peacock cry out as if announcing her insignificance to the manicured grounds. She should turn back. She should find the driver before he disappeared entirely, and beg him to return her to the coaching inn where she might find more suitable employment, something befitting a disgraced governess of 27 years with no references and no prospects, and nothing to recommend her but a stubborn refusal to simply disappear. But Eleanor had learned in her years of service that desperation made its own kind of courage, and so she walked forward on legs that trembled only slightly, her worn boots crunching against gravel that probably cost more than her annual salary had been. The great doors opened before she could knock, and a housekeeper with steel grey hair and eyes to match looked upon her with immediate and unconcealed disappointment. Mrs. Thornhill, she would later learn, had expected someone taller, someone fairer, someone worthy of whatever mysterious purpose had summoned this plain creature to their doorstep. Eleanor was led through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, who seemed to judge her passage, up staircases that spiraled toward painted ceilings, past servants who paused in their duties to whisper behind their hands, until at last she stood before a nursery door, and everything she thought she understood about her life shattered into pieces at her feet. The door opened. A small boy in a white nightshirt stood just inside, pale and serious, with grey eyes that looked ancient in his young face. He had not spoken in 3 years, they would tell her later, not since his mother drew her final breath. But in that moment, before Eleanor could introduce herself, before anyone could explain her presence, the child looked up at her with absolute certainty and spoke a single word that would echo through the halls and change everything. "Mother. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you." The word hung in the air between them, impossible and yet undeniable, and Eleanor felt her knees give way beneath her as she sank to the floor without any conscious decision to do so. The child stood before her with his small hand extended, palm upward, waiting with a patience that seemed far beyond his 4 years, and she found herself reaching out to take it, even as her mind screamed that this was madness, that she had never seen this boy before this moment, that she could not possibly be what he had named her. His fingers were cold and impossibly small as they wrapped around her own, and something in her chest cracked open at the touch. Some door she had long ago sealed shut against the pain of wanting what she could never have. Behind her, Mrs. Thornhill made a sound like a kettle about to boil over, sharp and hissing and full of accusation, and Eleanor heard footsteps gathering in the corridor, voices rising in urgent whispers that would soon become shouts. She did not turn to face them. She could not look away from those grey eyes that held her with such certainty, such absolute conviction that she was exactly who and what he had proclaimed her to be. Through the nursery windows, she saw a break in the clouds. A shaft of golden afternoon light that fell across the floor between them like a path being illuminated, and in that strange, suspended moment, she felt as though the world itself had paused to witness whatever was unfolding here. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Thornhill demanded, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade, and Eleanor heard the rustle of her skirts as she stepped closer, felt the weight of her suspicion pressing down like a physical force. "Who are you? What have you done to make him speak? What trickery is this?" But Eleanor had no answers, could not have spoken even if she possessed them, because Thomas had stepped closer still and was now studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, his free hand rising to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly before steadying against her skin. She felt tears gathering behind her eyes, absurd and unwelcome, because she had trained herself long ago not to cry, not when the accusations came, not when the dismissal was handed down, not when she walked away from the only employment she was likely to find, with nothing but lies trailing behind her like a shadow. "Send for His Highness immediately," Mrs. Thornhill ordered someone, and Eleanor heard running footsteps retreating down the corridor, and she understood then that she had stumbled into something far larger than a simple position caring for a child in need, that the anonymous letter had delivered her not to a modest household, but to the very heart of a storm she could not yet comprehend. The rain began in earnest outside, drumming against the windows with an urgency that matched the pounding of her heart, and Thomas spoke again. Just one more word, softer this time, a confirmation rather than a declaration. "Stay." And despite everything her rational mind was screaming, despite the danger gathering like thunderclouds in the faces of the servants watching from the doorway, despite the certain knowledge that she should flee before whatever reckoning was coming arrived to destroy what little remained of her reputation, Eleanor found herself nodding, found her voice at last, found a single word to offer in return. "Yes." She heard him before she saw him, the sharp, decisive footsteps of a man accustomed to being obeyed, echoing through the corridor like the approach of a gathering storm. And Eleanor rose to her feet with Thomas's small hand still clutching the worn fabric of her skirt, as if he feared she might vanish should he release her for even a moment. The servants parted like water before a ship's prow, and then he was there in the doorway, and Eleanor understood in an instant why the household moved with such careful deference, why the very air seemed to grow heavier with his presence. Prince Frederick Sinclair stood taller than she had imagined royalty might stand, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from something harder than flesh, and his grey eyes, so like his son's, yet so different in their cold fury, fixed upon her with an intensity that made her want to step backward, to flee, to become as invisible as she had always been. He wore dark formal attire that spoke of interrupted correspondence and duties abandoned, and the candles being lit around them caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained rage that simmered beneath a mask of aristocratic control. "What?" he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, rougher, as though the words themselves cost him something to speak. "Is the meaning of this spectacle?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but found her voice had abandoned her, stolen by the weight of his accusation and the impossibility of explaining something she did not herself understand. She had not asked to be called mother by a child she had never met, had not orchestrated whatever strange recognition had passed between them, had arrived with nothing more than desperate hope and an anonymous letter that now felt like a trap closing around her. Your Highness, Mrs. Thornhill interjected with obvious satisfaction. This woman arrived without proper introduction, and within moments had somehow provoked the young master to speak, though what dark arts she employed I cannot begin to imagine. Frederick's gaze did not waver from Eleanor's face, searching it as though he might find the answers written there, if only he looked hard enough, and she forced herself to meet those eyes, despite every instinct screaming at her to look away, to submit, to accept whatever judgment he chose to render. I employed nothing, she heard herself say, and the words emerged steadier than she felt, carrying a dignity she had not known she still possessed after weeks of humiliation and dismissal. I do not know your son. I have never seen him before this hour, and I am as bewildered by his words as anyone in this room. But she could feel Thomas pressing closer against her leg, feel his small fingers tightening their grip, and something fierce rose up within her chest, something that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the silent plea she sensed radiating from this child who had chosen her for reasons beyond her comprehension. Frederick's expression flickered, just for an instant, and Eleanor saw something beneath the fury, something raw and wounded and desperately afraid. And she understood then that his anger was not truly meant for her, but for the hope that Thomas's single word had awakened after 3 years of silence and grief. Outside, the storm had fully arrived, rain lashing against the windows like 1,000 urgent fingers demanding entry, and between them stood a little boy who had not released his hold on either his father's attention or Eleanor's skirt. A bridge of flesh and longing connecting 2 strangers who did not yet know how completely their lives were about to intertwine. Lady Harriet Chamberlain stood in the doorway of her brother's study, with her chin lifted and her hands clasped before her in a posture that spoke of determination, barely masking the tremor of uncertainty beneath. And Frederick turned from the window where he had been watching the rain streak down the glass to face her with an expression that made her step falter for just a moment before she recovered herself and entered fully into the room. "It was I," she said without preamble, her voice steady, despite the way her fingers tightened against each other until the knuckles went white. "I who sent the letter, I who arranged for Miss Ashworth to come here, and before you unleash whatever fury you have been storing since you left that nursery an hour ago, I ask only that you hear my reasons." Frederick said nothing, but the muscle that jumped in his jaw and the way his hands curled into fists at his sides spoke volumes that his silence could not contain, and Harriet pressed forward because she had come too far to retreat now, had invested too much hope in this gambit to abandon it at the first sign of her brother's wrath. "I lost my Edmund 6 years ago," she continued, and her voice cracked slightly on her son's name before she forced it steady again. "He was 3 years old, and he slipped away from a fever that no physician could break, and I would have given anything, Frederick, anything at all, to have had more time with him, to have heard his voice one more day, one more hour." She saw something shift in Frederick's expression, some crack in the ice that had encased him since Catherine's death, and she seized upon it with the desperation of a woman who had watched her nephew retreat into silence, while his father retreated into duty, and neither of them reached for the other across the chasm of their shared grief. "Thomas has been silent for 3 years," she said, "and you have tried nothing that mattered. You have hired nursemaids and nannies who saw only a broken child to be managed rather than a wounded soul to be healed. And when I learned of Miss Ashworth through Lady Pemberton, when I investigated her dismissal and found nothing but jealousy and lies behind it, when I read of her gift with children who others had deemed hopeless, I knew I had to try." Frederick's voice emerged rough and low, heavy with something that might have been betrayal or might have been the first stirring of hope he had permitted himself in years. "You should have told me." "I should have," Harriet agreed, "but you would have refused. You would have buried yourself deeper in your correspondence and your meetings and your endless dedication to everything except the child who needed you. And I could not watch Thomas disappear entirely into that silence, while you pretended he did not exist. The accusation hung between them, sharp and unavoidable, and Frederick turned back to the window because he could not bear to see the truth of it reflected in his sister's eyes. Meanwhile, in a small parlour on the other side of the house, Eleanor sat with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Her worn carpet bag resting against her feet like a faithful companion waiting to learn whether they would stay or go, and she stared at the flames dancing in the hearth while the storm raged outside and wondered what was being decided about her fate in rooms she would never be permitted to enter. The room they gave her was small, but finer than any she had occupied in her 27 years of modest existence, with walls papered in pale blue silk, and a narrow bed dressed in linens so soft that Eleanor found herself running her fingers across them again and again, as if to confirm their reality. And she stood now in borrowed nightclothes that hung too loosely on her frame, garments that had surely belonged to some lady's maid who had departed or perhaps been set aside specifically for guests of uncertain status, and her own worn blue dress hung over the back of a chair near the window where she had placed it to air out the dust and desperation of her journey. Through the door that connected her chamber to the nursery, she could hear nothing but silence, yet it was a different quality of silence than the oppressive stillness Mrs. Thornhill had described in her clipped tones when showing Eleanor to her quarters. And when Eleanor pressed her ear to the wood, she could almost sense the peace that had settled over the child who had spoken his first word in 3 years to a woman he had never met. The storm had passed now, and moonlight filtered through gaps in the clouds, casting silver patterns across the floorboards that shifted and changed like living things. And Eleanor moved to the window to look out over grounds she had barely glimpsed in the chaos of her arrival, seeing now the shapes of formal gardens gone wild and the distant dark mass of what must be forest beyond the manicured chaos. She should sleep. She knew this with the practical part of her mind that had governed her survival through years of service and dismissal and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. But her thoughts would not quiet themselves long enough to permit rest, circling instead around the mystery of Thomas's recognition and the fury in his father's grey eyes, and the strange, fierce protectiveness that had risen in her chest when she had stood between them. Somewhere in this vast house, she knew, Prince Frederick Sinclair was also awake, for she had heard the servants whispering as they guided her through corridors to this room, heard them say that the master had not slept properly since his wife's death, and that tonight of all nights would surely find him pacing his chambers until dawn. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was replaying the sound of his son's voice as she was replaying the weight of Thomas's small hand in hers, whether grief and hope were warring within him as painfully as uncertainty and determination warred within her. Carefully, so carefully that the hinges made no sound, Eleanor opened the connecting door and peered into the nursery where Thomas lay sleeping in a bed that seemed too large for such a small body. And in the moonlight, she could see his pale face peaceful at last, his fingers curled around a worn toy horse whose button eyes gleamed like tiny stars. And she understood in that moment that whatever had brought her here, whatever strange fate or desperate scheme or simple accident of timing, she could not leave this child now that she had found him. The morning light of October 15th filtered through the nursery windows with the pale golden quality particular to autumn, casting long shadows across the floor where Eleanor knelt beside Thomas's small bed and watched him watch her with those serious grey eyes that seemed to see far more than a child of 4 years ought to perceive, and she had barely slept, but found herself energized by a purpose she had not felt since her dismissal 3 weeks prior, a sense that she was exactly where she needed to be despite the impossibility of the circumstances that had brought her here. She helped Thomas dress in clothes he selected himself, a small act of independence that made the nursemaid who had come to check on them raise her eyebrows in surprise, and Eleanor pretended not to notice the way the woman's gaze lingered on her worn blue dress before she departed to report whatever observations she had gathered to whatever authority awaited her account. It was in the corridor outside the nursery, as Eleanor guided Thomas toward the small breakfast room she had been shown the night before, that she first heard them, the whispered voices of servants who did not realize or did not care that sound carried differently in these old stone hallways than it might in more modest homes. "Plain as a sparrow and twice as dull," one voice said with the casual cruelty of those who consider themselves unobserved, and another answered with a low laugh, "Lady Diana will not be pleased that such a creature has caught the young master's fancy." She had rather hoped to play the maternal figure herself, and secure the prince's affections through his son. Eleanor's steps did not falter, though something tightened painfully in her chest, and she kept her hand steady on Thomas's shoulder as they continued past the alcove where the gossiping maids had concealed themselves, their sudden silence confirming they had realized their audience too late. She had heard such assessments before, had grown accustomed to being overlooked and undervalued in the homes where she had served, but something about hearing it here, in this place where a child had looked at her and spoken a word that had not passed his lips in 3 years, cut deeper than she had expected. Thomas tugged at her hand, and she looked down to find him studying her face with that uncanny attention. And though he did not speak again, he pressed his small, warm palm more firmly into hers, as if to offer comfort he could not yet voice. And Eleanor felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed where anyone might see them. In the breakfast room she focused on Thomas entirely, offering him small bites of toast, and watching the way he responded to her suggestions with nods and headshakes that constituted more interaction than the household had seen from him in years. And she told herself that Lady Diana Crawford, whoever she was, and the whispered opinions of servants who did not know her, could not matter, that only this child mattered, this silent boy who had somehow recognized in her something worth calling mother. The afternoon of October the 17th found Eleanor wandering the corridors of the great house, while Thomas slept peacefully in his nursery, his small body curled around Captain the toy horse in a posture of contentment that the household staff had whispered they had not witnessed in years. And she told herself she was merely learning the layout of her new home. But in truth, she was searching for something she could not name, some clue to the mystery that had wrapped itself around her since the moment a silent child had looked into her unremarkable face and spoken a word that had not crossed his lips since his mother's death. The East Gallery was clearly avoided by the servants, dust motes dancing in the pale autumn light that filtered through tall windows overlooking grounds carpeted in fallen leaves of amber and rust, and Eleanor's footsteps left visible prints in the fine layer of neglect that coated the parquet floor as she moved deeper into the abandoned wing. She saw the shrouded shape before she understood what it was, a large rectangle draped in white cloth that hung against the far wall like a ghost awaiting acknowledgement, and something in her chest tightened with premonition as she approached it with hands that trembled slightly, despite her attempts at steadiness. The cloth came away easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally draw it aside, and Eleanor found herself staring into the painted eyes of the most beautiful woman she had ever seen, a creature of golden hair and porcelain skin and features so perfectly arranged that they seemed almost impossible, and she knew immediately and with absolute certainty that this was Princess Catherine Sinclair, the mother Thomas had lost, the wife Frederick still mourned, the woman whose place Eleanor could never hope to fill. There was no resemblance between them, none whatsoever, for where Catherine was luminous, Eleanor was plain, where Catherine's hair gleamed like spun sunlight. Eleanor's hung in mousy brown waves that refused to hold any fashionable style, Where Catherine's eyes sparkled with crystalline beauty, Eleanor's were merely brown, merely ordinary, merely forgettable. Yet as Eleanor stood transfixed before the portrait, she noticed something in the painted gaze that made her breath catch, a warmth there, a gentleness in the slight curve of Catherine's smile that spoke of kindness rather than cold beauty. And she recognized with a strange shock that she had seen that same expression reflected back at her from mirrors when she looked at Thomas. Not the face, never the face, but something behind the eyes, something in the quality of attention that perhaps a child too young for words had nonetheless perceived and remembered and longed for through 3 years of grief-stricken silence. Eleanor stood alone in that dusty gallery, with tears tracking silently down her cheeks, understanding now that Thomas had not mistaken her for his mother, but had perhaps recognized in her the same capacity for love that he had lost, and she wondered if she was equal to the weight of such recognition, if a plain spinster from a genteel but impoverished family could possibly live up to the ghost of such radiant perfection. The morning of October 21st dawned cold enough that fires had been lit in the nursery before Eleanor woke, and she found Thomas already sitting up in his small bed with Captain the toy horse clutched against his chest, and his grey eyes fixed upon her face with that intensity that had become familiar over the week since her arrival. A week in which she had slowly transformed the nursery into something warmer and more alive by adding potted plants from the conservatory and arranging his toys where he could reach them and opening the curtains wide each morning to let in whatever light the autumn sky offered. She had developed a routine with him that the household found peculiar, for she did not insist on formal lessons or proper comportment, but instead told him stories, endless stories about brave horses and kind princes and magical gardens where flowers could speak, and she took him outside when the weather permitted to feel the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his small boots and to learn the names of things, oak and maple and chrysanthemum. Words he seemed to drink in even when he could not yet speak them back to her. This morning she was telling him about a horse very much like Captain, who had once saved a kingdom by carrying a message through a terrible storm, and Thomas was leaning forward with unusual animation, his lips moving slightly as if practicing sounds he had forgotten how to make, when suddenly he looked up at her with fierce concentration and spoke his second word in 3 years of silence, a word that was not mother, but something perhaps even more significant. "Ellie," he said, the nickname she had given him permission to use days ago when she had whispered that her friends called her Ellie, and perhaps he might like to be her friend, and the sound of it in his small, determined voice broke something open in her chest that she had not known was sealed. She gathered him into her arms and held him close while tears slipped down her cheeks. And she did not see the figure standing in the shadowed doorway of the nursery, did not notice how Prince Frederick Sinclair had frozen in place with one hand gripping the doorframe as if it alone kept him upright, did not witness the way his severe features crumpled for just a moment into an expression of such raw and unguarded emotion that it transformed him entirely from the cold, distant prince into simply a father hearing his son speak to someone with trust and affection. Frederick remained there for several minutes more as Eleanor dried her eyes and praised Thomas and began their morning routine of naming the plants on the windowsill, and Thomas repeated each word after her with growing confidence: tree and leaf and flower and sunshine. And Frederick watched this plain, unremarkable woman in her worn grey dress perform what the finest physicians and most expensive specialists in England had declared impossible. He withdrew before she could notice him, retreating to his study with Thomas's voice echoing in his mind alongside the image of Eleanor's tear-streaked face illuminated by morning light, and he sat at his desk for a long while doing nothing at all except reconsidering everything he had believed about worthlessness and worth. The afternoon of October 25th brought an invitation that Eleanor knew immediately was not kindness, but calculation. A folded note on cream paper requesting her presence at tea in the Rose Salon, where Lady Diana Crawford and several other ladies of quality had gathered, and though every instinct told her this was a trap, she could not refuse without appearing ungrateful or cowardly. So she smoothed her worn grey dress and pinched colour into her pale cheeks and descended to face whatever awaited her with what dignity she could muster. The Rose Salon had been Princess Catherine's favourite room, Eleanor had learned from the servants, and it was decorated in shades of pink and gold that seemed designed to make her own drab appearance all the more conspicuous, and Lady Diana sat at its centre like a queen holding court, her emerald necklace catching the light from tall windows, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her smile sharp as a blade barely concealed beneath silk. The other ladies were satellites orbiting Diana's brilliance, their eyes flickering to Eleanor with the eager cruelty of spectators at a blood sport, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench as she took the seat indicated, a chair positioned slightly apart as if she carried some contagion that proximity might spread. Lady Harriet was present too, Eleanor noted with a flicker of relief, seated near the window with tension visible in the set of her shoulders, though she could offer little protection against what was clearly a coordinated assault. The attack began with sweetness, Diana inquiring after dear little Thomas with honeyed concern, then pivoting smoothly to questions about Eleanor's background, her family, her previous position, each query designed to expose the shabbiness of her circumstances. And Eleanor answered as briefly as courtesy allowed, while the other ladies exchanged glances laden with contempt. "Such a noble sacrifice you make," Diana observed, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "devoting yourself to service when you might have had a life of your own, though I suppose at your age, and with your particular limitations, the options must be rather narrow," and the other ladies tittered behind their teacups, while Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite her determination to remain unmoved. She was aware suddenly of a presence in the adjacent room, the sound of the connecting door slightly ajar, but she could not allow herself to be distracted as Diana continued her dissection, remarking on the peculiarity of a plain governess succeeding where specialists had failed, suggesting perhaps some trickery was involved, some manipulation of a vulnerable child, and Eleanor felt something harden within her chest as she lifted her chin and met Diana's beautiful, mocking eyes. "I have no arts to employ, Lady Crawford," she said quietly, "only patience and affection, which I understand may seem like trickery to those unfamiliar with such qualities." And the room went silent as Diana's smile froze, and Harriet made a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter. And in the adjacent room, a man who had been standing motionless by the cracked door felt something shift irrevocably in his understanding of the woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice. The morning of October 28th brought a crystalline quality to the air that suggested winter was no longer a distant threat, but an approaching reality. And Eleanor had bundled Thomas in his warmest coat before venturing into the garden that had once been Princess Catherine's pride and now grew wild with neglect, its roses unpruned and its pathways obscured by fallen leaves that crunched satisfyingly beneath their feet as Thomas led her deeper into the overgrown sanctuary with an enthusiasm she had not seen from him before. She had discovered quite by accident that he loved the outdoors, that something in him unfurled and relaxed when surrounded by living, growing things. And so she had made these garden excursions part of their daily routine, despite Mrs. Thornhill's disapproval and the curious glances from servants who watched them from windows. And today, Thomas was practicing his expanding vocabulary by naming everything he could see, while Eleanor knelt in the cold soil to show him the hardy chrysanthemums that still bloomed gold and russet against the dying foliage. "Tree," Thomas said with growing confidence, pointing at a grand oak whose leaves had turned to burnished copper, and then leaf and flower and Ellie, looking at her with such open affection that she felt her heart contract with something between joy and grief, and she was so absorbed in his progress that she did not hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across them both, and she looked up with dirt on her hands and a smudge on her cheek to find Prince Frederick standing at the edge of the overgrown path, watching them with an expression she could not decipher. She scrambled to rise, mortified by her dishevelled appearance, but he gestured for her to remain where she was with an uncharacteristic gentleness, and then he did something that shocked her more than any reprimand might have. He lowered himself to kneel beside them in the cold earth, heedless of his fine riding clothes, and asked Thomas, in a voice roughened by disuse, what flowers they were examining today. Thomas looked between Eleanor and his father with wide, uncertain eyes, before answering Chrysanthemum in a careful approximation of the word Eleanor had taught him, and Frederick's face transformed in that moment from severity to something raw and wondering that made him almost unrecognizable as the cold prince who had accused her of charlatanry 2 weeks ago. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, while Thomas returned to his examination of petals, "I find I owe you an apology that I have been too proud to offer." And Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the cold air, as she met his grey eyes and saw in them a reflection of her own cautious hope. The garden held them all suspended in that moment, the overgrown rows and unpruned hedges forming walls around their small circle of unlikely connection, and when Thomas reached up to take his father's hand, and then Eleanor's, and said with determined clarity, "Stay, please, Papa," Frederick did not pull away, but instead allowed himself to be anchored there, between his son and the plain, remarkable woman who had somehow brought them both back to life. The morning of November the 2nd brought with it a commotion that Eleanor heard before she understood. The clatter of hooves on gravel and the urgent scurrying of servants that seemed to transform the household from its increasingly comfortable rhythms into something rigid and formal that made her stomach clench with unnamed dread. And when Mrs. Thornhill appeared in the nursery doorway with a face like granite and announced that the Dowager Queen had arrived without warning and wished to see the child and his caretaker immediately, Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, and her first wild thought was to gather Thomas and flee through the garden gate before she could be subjected to royal judgment that would surely find her wanting in every conceivable way. Thomas seemed to sense her fear because he pressed closer to her side and gripped her hand with surprising strength, his grey eyes wide and watchful, and it was his trust more than her own courage that made Eleanor straighten her spine and smooth her plain brown dress and follow Mrs. Thornhill down the grand staircase to where the Dowager Queen Margaret Sinclair stood in the entrance hall like a figure carved from ice and disapproval, her silver hair perfectly coiffed beneath a hat adorned with black feathers, her eyes the same piercing grey as her son and grandson, but colder somehow and infinitely more assessing as they swept over Eleanor from her simply dressed hair to her worn but polished shoes and found nothing worthy of approval. "So this is the miracle worker," the Dowager said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "This is the creature who has accomplished what physicians and specialists could not." And Eleanor felt herself being catalogued and dismissed in the space of a single breath, while Frederick stood rigid beside his mother, with tension visible in every line of his body, and something that might have been warning in the glance he sent Eleanor's way. Thomas had been silent since they descended, overwhelmed perhaps by the formality, and the stranger who looked at his Ellie with such coldness. But when the Dowager turned her attention to him and demanded in imperious tones that he demonstrate this supposed recovery, he surprised everyone, including Eleanor, by stepping slightly in front of her in a protective gesture that seemed far beyond his 4 years, and saying in his small, clear voice, "My Ellie, as if claiming her against whatever threat this imposing woman might represent. The dowager's expression flickered then, something cracking beneath the frozen surface as she heard her grandson speak for the first time since his mother's death, and Eleanor watched the older woman's gloved hand tremble almost imperceptibly before she mastered herself and said in a voice that had lost some of its cutting edge that she would be staying for the week to observe this situation personally, and that she expected full cooperation from everyone, including the presumptuous young woman who had apparently bewitched an entire household. And as Eleanor curtsied and murmured her acquiescence, she caught Frederick's eye across the marble expanse of the entrance hall and saw in his gaze something that looked almost like solidarity, as if they had somehow become allies in a battle she had not known she was fighting until the enemy arrived at the gates. The week that followed the dowager's arrival became for Eleanor a trial by fire in which every gesture was scrutinized and every word weighed against some invisible standard of worthiness that she could never hope to meet. And yet she found herself rising each morning with renewed determination, because Thomas needed her, and because somewhere in the exhausting parade of formal meals and pointed questions and cold silences, she had begun to glimpse something unexpected. Frederick's quiet defense of her presence, offered in small ways that his mother could not openly challenge, but that Eleanor felt like warming flames against the November chill that had settled over the estate. On the morning of November 5th, Lady Diana arrived with correspondence she claimed proved Eleanor had been dismissed for theft rather than the jealousy of an employer, and Eleanor stood pale and trembling in the dowager's sitting room while the accusation hung in the air like poison. But before she could speak, Frederick entered with Lord Hastings at his side and announced in a voice that brooked no argument that his adviser had conducted a thorough investigation and found the accusations against Miss Ashworth to be entirely fabricated by a woman whose husband had shown Eleanor inappropriate attention. And the look he gave Diana as he spoke contained a warning that made even that formidable lady fall silent. The dowager watched this exchange with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and Eleanor saw something shift in the older woman's expression when Thomas ran to Eleanor afterward and buried his face against her skirt and said in his small, clear voice, "Ellie stays, Ellie mine," with a possessiveness that seemed to settle the matter more effectively than any investigation could have done. The days blurred together after that, marked by Thomas's expanding vocabulary and the evening conversations that had become Eleanor's secret sustenance, when Frederick would find her in his study after Thomas slept, and they would speak of books and philosophy, and the small details of their days while firelight painted gold across his severe features. And Eleanor forgot for those precious hours that she was plain and poor and impossibly beneath him. Harriet provided her with new dresses, claiming they were cast-offs but clearly newly made, and Eleanor wore them with gratitude that went deeper than fabric and stitching, because she understood that Harriet was arming her for a battle she had not chosen to fight. On the evening of November the 10th, the dowager summoned Eleanor privately and studied her for a long moment before saying that she had never seen her grandson so alive, that she did not understand how a woman of no particular beauty or breeding had accomplished what the finest specialists could not, but that she was not so proud as to deny evidence before her own eyes, and that Eleanor might stay so long as she remembered her place. And Eleanor curtsied and murmured her thanks, while something in her heart sang with triumph, and something else whispered that her place was becoming increasingly unclear, even to herself. That same night, Frederick caught her hand as she passed him in the corridor and held it for just a moment longer than propriety allowed. And when their eyes met, Eleanor saw in his gaze a reflection of her own impossible hope. The evening of November 15th arrived with a sharp clarity that seemed to herald change, the kind of crystalline autumn night when stars burned bright against velvet darkness and breath hung visible in the air. And Eleanor sat in the nursery with Thomas on her lap, reading from a book of fairy tales while the fire crackled and popped, when Frederick appeared in the doorway with an expression she had never seen before, something between nervousness and determination that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish and made her heart stutter in a way she could not afford to acknowledge. Thomas looked up and said, "Papa, stay," with the easy affection that had bloomed between father and son over the past weeks, and Frederick crossed the room to settle into the chair beside them with a naturalness that would have seemed impossible a month ago, and for a long moment the three of them existed in a bubble of warmth and firelight that felt dangerously like family. "I have an announcement to make," Frederick said finally, and Eleanor felt something shift in the air between them as he explained that he intended to host a Christmas ball to celebrate Thomas's recovery, that invitations would go out to all the finest families, that the Dowager had already given her approval, and that he wished most particularly for Eleanor to attend not as a servant observing from the margins, but as a guest properly presented and properly dressed. Eleanor's hand stilled on the book, and she felt the blood rise to her cheeks as she struggled to formulate a response that would convey the impossibility of what he suggested, without revealing how desperately some treacherous part of her longed to accept. "Your Highness," she began, but he interrupted her with a gesture that was almost impatient, saying that he was well aware of the scandal it would cause, that he knew Lady Diana and half the ton would whisper behind their fans and find it presumptuous beyond measure, but that he found he cared very little for their opinions when weighed against the debt he owed her for giving him back his son. Thomas had fallen asleep against Eleanor's shoulder, his small body warm and trusting, and she looked down at his peaceful face rather than meet Frederick's gaze as she said quietly that she had nothing to wear to such an event, that her presence would embarrass him regardless of his intentions, that she was a governess and a spinster and possessed none of the graces that such an occasion required. Frederick rose then and crossed to where she sat, and when he spoke his voice was lower than before, meant only for her ears, despite the sleeping child between them. "Harriet will see to the dress," he said, "and as for graces, Miss Ashworth, you possess more genuine grace than any woman I have ever known, and I find I am tired of pretending otherwise." And Eleanor looked up at last, and saw in his grey eyes something that terrified her far more than the Dowager's scrutiny or Diana's schemes, something that looked like hope. Lady Diana Crawford arrived at the estate on the morning of November the 16th with the determination of a general preparing for battle, her emerald travelling ensemble perfectly coordinating with the jewels at her throat as she swept into the entrance hall and demanded to know why she had not been consulted about the Christmas ball before invitations were sent to half the noble families in England, and Eleanor, who had been crossing the gallery above with Thomas's hand in hers, paused at the sound of that imperious voice and felt the familiar chill of inadequacy settle into her bones, even as Thomas tugged at her fingers and said, "Diana," loud, with the perceptive honesty of childhood that made Eleanor suppress an inappropriate smile. The days that followed became a strange dance of preparation and tension, with seamstresses arriving from London at Harriet's instruction and fabric samples appearing in Eleanor's small room, despite her protests that such finery was wasted on someone of her station, and through it all, Diana moved through the house like a beautiful serpent, dispensing compliments that cut and suggestions that undermined, telling Eleanor in tones of false concern that perhaps she might observe the ball from the musicians' gallery, where she would be more comfortable among her own kind, and Eleanor bore it all with a composure that cost her more than anyone could see, because she had learned long ago that dignity was the only armor available to women without beauty or fortune. Frederick found her one evening in the library, standing before the fire with her arms wrapped around herself, as if holding something broken together. And when she turned at the sound of his footstep, her eyes were bright with unshed tears that she immediately blinked away, and something in his chest cracked at the sight of this woman who had given his son back to him, trying so desperately to pretend she was not hurting. She told him then, in halting words, that she could not attend the ball, that her presence would embarrass him and give Diana ammunition to use against him politically, that she was content to remain in the nursery where she belonged, while the glittering world celebrated below. And Frederick listened in silence until she finished, and then crossed the room to stand before her with an intensity that stole her breath. "You speak of belonging," he said quietly, "but you fail to understand that you have given this house something it lost 3 years ago. You have given my son his voice and his laughter. You have given my sister her hope. You have given even my mother pause in her certainties, and you have given me, Miss Ashworth, something I thought I would never feel again. And I will not have you hidden away like something shameful when you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Eleanor stood frozen, unable to process words that seemed to rearrange everything she understood about her place in this world. And when Frederick reached out and took her hand, she did not pull away, but let the warmth of his touch anchor her, while somewhere above them Thomas slept peacefully, and somewhere below Diana schemed, and somewhere outside the first snow of winter began to fall. Part 15. Transformation begins. Temporal anchor. Date: November 20th, 1814. Time since last event: 4 days since library declaration. Time of day: afternoon. Character state: tracking. Eleanor: submitting to dress fittings with mixed emotions, beginning to allow herself hope, terrified of public exposure. Harriet: delighting in Eleanor's transformation, sees what Frederick cannot yet admit. Diana: increasingly desperate, spreading rumors about Eleanor's unsuitability. Thomas: excited about the ball, practicing words to describe it. Scene goals show Eleanor's physical transformation beginning. Harriet and Eleanor develop genuine friendship. Diana's escalating schemes revealed. Eleanor overhears servants defending her for the first time. The dressmaker's pins pricked Eleanor's skin as she stood motionless in Harriet's private sitting room on the afternoon of November 20th, surrounded by bolts of silk in colors she had never imagined wearing, and she caught her reflection in the tall mirror and hardly recognized the woman who stared back at her with wide, uncertain eyes, for the gown taking shape around her was the deep blue of a winter twilight, and it made her unremarkable features seem somehow softer and her mousy hair appear almost warm in the candlelight. Harriet circled her with the satisfied expression of an artist surveying her canvas, declaring that the color was perfect and that Eleanor would turn every head in the ballroom, and Eleanor wanted to protest that turning heads was precisely what she feared, but found she could not speak past the strange tightness in her throat. The seamstress adjusted the bodice with practiced hands, while Harriet chatted about hairstyles and borrowed jewels, and the expression Frederick had worn when he first saw his late wife descend the staircase at their engagement ball, and Eleanor's heart clenched at the comparison, even as Harriet hastily added that she did not mean Eleanor should try to replace Catherine, but rather that Frederick deserved to feel that wonder again. Thomas appeared in the doorway clutching Captain the toy horse, and announced Ellie Pretty in his small, clear voice that still made everyone pause with gratitude each time he spoke, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she knelt to embrace him, heedless of the pins, because this child's love was the one thing she trusted completely in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly full of possibility. Later that evening, as Eleanor walked through the servants' corridor, taking the back route to the nursery as had become her habit, she heard voices and paused in the shadows to listen, expecting the usual cruel commentary about the plain governess with ideas above her station. But Mrs. Thornhill's voice carried a different tone than Eleanor had ever heard directed toward her. telling a younger maid that Miss Ashworth had more genuine kindness in her little finger than Lady Diana Crawford possessed in her entire elegant body, and that any fool could see His Highness looked at the governess like she hung the moon, and that if certain scheming ladies thought they could turn the household against someone who had given them back their young master's voice, they had another thing coming entirely. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that rose unbidden, because she had spent so many years being invisible and dismissed and found wanting that she had forgotten what it felt like to be championed. And somewhere in the distance she heard Diana's laugh ring out sharp and false, a reminder that not everyone in this house wished her well. Part 16. Diana's Desperate Gambit. The snow fell heavier on the morning of November the 22nd as Lady Diana Crawford stood in the Dowager Queen's private sitting room with documents clutched in her gloved hands, documents she had paid a considerable sum to obtain from Eleanor's former employer, and her voice carried the sweetnesses of poison as she laid out her case against the woman who had somehow bewitched an entire household into forgetting their place and their duty to the crown. The Dowager listened with the impassive expression she had perfected over decades of court intrigue, her grey eyes revealing nothing as Diana spoke of Eleanor's dismissal for theft and inappropriate conduct with a male guest. Accusations that Lord Hastings had already investigated and dismissed, but which Diana now presented with forged corroboration from a maid who had supposedly witnessed the entire sordid affair. Frederick entered without announcement, his face pale with fury as he realized what Diana was attempting, and behind him came Lord Hastings himself with counter-evidence that exposed the forgery so thoroughly that even Diana's considerable composure cracked for a moment before she rallied with claims that she was merely trying to protect the family from a woman of low character who had clearly enchanted them all. The Dowager rose from her chair with the terrible dignity that had made grown men tremble in her presence, and told Diana that she had observed Miss Ashworth for nearly 3 weeks now, and had seen nothing but genuine devotion to Thomas, had seen her grandson speak for the first time in years, had watched her own cold and distant son begin to thaw like a frozen river in spring, and that if Diana thought such obvious jealousy masquerading as concern would move the Queen Mother to dismiss the first person who had brought light back into this grief-shadowed house, then Diana had gravely miscalculated her audience. Diana's face went white, then red as she gathered herself to leave with what remained of her dignity. But Frederick stopped her with words that carried the formal weight of royal decree, informing Lady Crawford that her invitation to the Christmas ball was hereby rescinded and that she would no longer be welcome at any Sinclair residence, pending his review of her conduct. And the sound Diana made as she swept from the room was something between a sob and a snarl that echoed through the corridor. Eleanor knew nothing of this confrontation until that evening when Harriet appeared in the nursery doorway with champagne and news, laughing as she recounted Diana's downfall while Thomas played with Captain on the rug, and asked what champagne meant and whether he could taste it. Later still, Frederick came to the nursery himself, something he had never done since Catherine's death, and he knelt beside Thomas and told his son that he was sorry for being gone so long, and Thomas reached out with one small hand and patted his father's cheek and said, "Love you, Papa." And Frederick wept openly for the first time in 3 years, while Eleanor stood in the doorway with her heart breaking and mending all at once. Part 17. The Eve of Transformation. The morning of December 23rd dawned crisp and bright over Ashworth Hall, and Eleanor stood at her window watching the servants scurry across the snow-covered grounds carrying armfuls of evergreen boughs and holly branches, while inside the great house every room hummed with preparation for the ball that would take place the following evening, and she pressed her hand to the cold glass and wondered how she had arrived at this moment when just 2 months ago she had been a disgraced governess with nothing but a worn carpet-bag and fading hope. Thomas burst through the connecting door, still in his nightclothes with Captain clutched under one arm, demanding to know if it was time for the ball yet and whether he could stay up to see Ellie in her blue dress. And Eleanor laughed and scooped him into her arms and told him he must be patient because there was still one more sleep before the dancing began. And he sighed with the dramatic impatience of a 4-year-old who had discovered that having words meant he could express every feeling that crossed his small heart. Frederick found them like that an hour later, Eleanor sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor in her plain morning dress, while Thomas attempted to teach Captain how to waltz. And he paused in the doorway with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between wonder and longing, and a third thing that made her cheeks warm and her pulse quicken. He entered the room properly for only the second time since Catherine's death, and lowered himself to sit beside them on the carpet. His formal coat incongruous against the scattered toys and picture books, and Thomas immediately climbed into his lap and began explaining very seriously that Captain was not a good dancer, but Eleanor said practice made progress, and so they must be patient with him. The three of them sat there in the winter sunlight, streaming through the nursery windows, while the household bustled around them preparing for the grandest event of the season, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. And when Frederick's hand brushed hers, reaching for one of Thomas's fallen blocks, she did not pull away, and neither did he. Later that afternoon, she submitted to the final fitting of her gown, while Harriet fussed over accessories, and Mrs. Thornhill appeared with hot chocolate for everyone, and the quiet declaration that Miss Ashworth would be the finest lady at the ball, regardless of what certain banished persons might think. And Eleanor had to excuse herself to the window, because the kindness was overwhelming after so many years of coldness and dismissal. That evening, Frederick sought her out in his study, as had become their habit. But instead of discussing Thomas or household matters, he asked her about her childhood, her dreams, the books she loved, and she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. While the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, and somewhere in the house Thomas slept peacefully, dreaming of dancing with his toy horse. Part 18. The Christmas Eve Ball. The ballroom of Ashworth Hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of December 24th, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors until the entire space seemed to shimmer with golden fire, and Eleanor stood at the top of the grand staircase, in her midnight blue gown, feeling as though she had stepped into a dream from which she might wake at any moment to find herself back in her cramped lodgings with nothing but memories of this impossible autumn. The gown fit her perfectly now after the final alterations, the silk whispering against her skin as she moved, and Harriet had woven silver ribbons through her mousy brown hair until it caught the candlelight and gleamed with unexpected warmth. And when she looked in the mirror before descending, she had not recognized herself, but more importantly, she had finally recognized her own worth, shining through eyes that no longer apologized for existing. The guests below numbered nearly 200, the finest families in England gathered to celebrate the miraculous recovery of young Lord Thomas Sinclair, and their faces turned upward as Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs with whispers rippling through the crowd, like wind through wheat, because everyone knew the story now of the plain governess, who had unlocked a silent prince with nothing but patience and love. Frederick waited at the bottom of the staircase in formal black evening attire, with the Sinclair family crest glittering on his chest, and his grey eyes never left Eleanor's face as she descended each step with careful grace. And when she reached him, he offered his arm with a bow that silenced every whisper, because princes did not bow to servants, and yet here he was bending before her as though she were the royalty, and he merely a man hoping for her favour. Thomas had been allowed to watch from the gallery above with his nursemaid, and his small voice rang out clear and joyful across the ballroom, calling down that Ellie looked like a princess and Papa should dance with her right now, and the laughter that followed was warm rather than mocking, because even the most hardened society matrons found it difficult to sneer at a child's innocent delight. The orchestra began to play, and Frederick led Eleanor onto the floor for the first waltz, his hand warm and steady at her waist, and as they turned together beneath the blazing chandeliers, he looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch, and told her quietly that she was the most beautiful woman in the room, and he would fight anyone who dared suggest otherwise. The Dowager Queen watched from her throne-like chair at the head of the room with an expression that had shifted over the weeks from suspicion to grudging respect to something that might almost be called hope. And beside her, Harriet wiped tears from her eyes and whispered that her brother had finally returned from the frozen wasteland of grief where he had wandered for 3 long years. The night spun on in a blur of music and champagne and dancing, and Eleanor found herself welcomed by people who would have cut her dead 2 months ago, and she understood that she was witnessing the impossible alchemy of love, transforming not just 2 hearts, but an entire household. Part 19. The Midnight Garden. The clock in the great hall struck midnight as Frederick led Eleanor away from the crowded ballroom through a side door she had not noticed before, and the sudden quiet of the corridor wrapped around them like a velvet cloak after the overwhelming symphony of music and conversation and tinkling crystal that had filled the previous hours with such dizzy brightness. He did not speak as they walked, and neither did she, their footsteps echoing softly on marble floors polished to a mirror shine. And when they reached a set of glass doors that opened onto the snow-covered garden, Eleanor caught her breath because the winter landscape had been transformed by moonlight into something from a fairy story, with every branch and hedge and dormant flower bed glittering silver and white beneath a sky scattered with stars. Frederick helped her into a fur-lined cloak that a footman had somehow anticipated they would need, and his hands lingered at her shoulders for a moment longer than necessary as he settled the heavy fabric around her. And when she looked up at him, his grey eyes held none of the coldness she had encountered that first terrible afternoon when he had accused her of being a charlatan and a threat to his wounded son. They walked together through the crystalline garden, following paths that Catherine had designed years ago, but which Eleanor had helped restore to beauty over the past weeks, and the snow crunched beneath their feet, and their breath formed clouds in the frozen air, and somewhere behind them the muffled strains of the orchestra played on for guests who had not yet noticed the host's absence. He stopped beside the stone bench where they had sat together that October morning when Thomas had asked his father to stay, and he turned to face Eleanor with an expression she had never seen before on his aristocratic features, something vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. And she understood suddenly that this proud prince was as frightened of what was happening between them as she was. He told her that he had believed himself incapable of feeling anything after Catherine died, that he had locked his heart away so thoroughly he had forgotten it existed, and that watching her bring his son back to life had somehow accomplished the same miracle for him without his permission or understanding. The tears that slipped down Eleanor's cheeks were warm against her cold skin, and she did not try to hide them, because she had learned over these transformative months that true strength lay not in concealment but in honest feeling. And when Frederick reached out to brush them away with fingers that trembled slightly, she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun after a long winter. He asked her if she could possibly consider a future she had never dreamed of claiming, a life beyond anything her circumstances had ever promised, and before she could answer, he told her that he was not offering her position or wealth or title, but simply himself, a broken man made whole by her quiet courage and boundless love. Eleanor answered him with the only words her overflowing heart could find, telling him that she had arrived at Ashworth Hall with nothing but a worn carpet bag and faded dreams, and that she would leave with him, possessing everything she had ever secretly wished for in those lonely nights when she had believed herself destined for obscurity and solitude. Frederick's face transformed at her acceptance, and the severe prince who had terrified her that first stormy afternoon vanished, entirely replaced by a man radiant with joy and disbelief and something that looked remarkably like reverence. And when he gathered her into his arms, there beneath the winter stars, she understood that this embrace was not merely a promise, but a homecoming for two souls who had wandered lost until fate and a perceptive sister and one miraculous child had conspired to bring them together. The snow began to fall again as they stood, wrapped in each other's warmth, soft flakes drifting down from the velvet darkness above to settle on Eleanor's silver-threaded hair, and Frederick's broad shoulders, like nature itself, was blessing their union with its quiet benediction. He told her that he had a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and that it was nothing compared to the jewels Diana Crawford wore, but that it had been given in love 4 generations ago, and he could think of no hand more worthy to wear it. And Eleanor laughed through her tears and told him that she had never wanted emeralds or diamonds, only to be seen and valued and loved for exactly who she was. From the gallery above the ballroom, a small voice called out into the night, and they both turned to see Thomas pressed against the frost-covered window, with his nursemaid hovering anxiously behind him, and the boy's words carried clearly through the cold air, asking if Papa had asked Ellie to stay forever yet, because he had been waiting and waiting, and he was very tired. Frederick laughed, then a sound Eleanor had rarely heard from him, full and genuine, and free of the shadows that had haunted his grey eyes since she first met him. And he called back to his son that yes, he had asked, and yes, she had agreed, and Thomas should go to bed immediately, because tomorrow they would all 3 have breakfast together as a family. The word hung in the frozen air between them, shimmering with promise, and Eleanor felt it settle into her chest like a gift she had never dared request from a world that had offered her so little. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever whispers the tone would spread, whatever obstacles Diana Crawford might still attempt to place in their path, she had found at last the place where she belonged. They walked back through the snow-covered garden, hand in hand, taking the long way around so they might have a few more moments alone before rejoining the glittering world that awaited them inside. And Eleanor thought of that frightened woman who had stood at the gates of Ashworth Hall just over 2 months ago with her single bag and her battered hopes, and she sent a silent message of comfort across time, telling her former self that everything impossible was about to become beautifully, wonderfully real.